Jerusalem had fallen. Above the city, sacred stones stood under a new flag. Beneath them lay older memories, kings, altars, ruins, and a vanished temple whose absence seemed almost heavier than its walls had ever been. Then came a small band of knights, poor, armed, and sworn to protect pilgrims. They took residence near the place crusaders associated with Solomon's temple. From that moment, their identity became tied to something no one could see. A lost sanctuary beneath centuries of conquest, prayer, and longing. Why would warriors bind themselves to a vanished temple? And what did that name make the world believe? To follow that question, we have to move carefully. Not with the certainty of treasure hunters, and not with the appetite of legends that already know what they want to find. We begin instead with a city layered in faith, fear, victory, and misunderstanding. A place where geography was never just geography. The Temple Mount was not an empty backdrop for medieval imagination. It was one of the most charged spaces on Earth, a height where different traditions carried different truths, and where every stone seemed to belong to more than one story at once. After the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, they inherited not only buildings and streets, but meanings. Some ancient, some mistaken, some deliberately remade. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we are not chasing proof of a hidden chamber or a relic wrapped in gold. We are looking at something stranger, how a military order born in poverty came to stand beside the memory of Solomon's temple, and how that association became powerful enough to outlive the knights themselves. Because sometimes the deepest secret beneath a sacred place is not what was buried there. It is what people needed to believe was buried there. Chapter 2. A temple that became a legend. Long before medieval knights gave themselves its name, Solomon's temple had already become more than a building. To understand why that mattered, we have to imagine the temple not as a ruin and not as an archaeological argument, but as a living center of a people's world. In the biblical imagination, it was the house raised by King Solomon, son of David, a royal sanctuary where kingship, worship, sacrifice, and national identity met in one charged place. It was not simply where people went to pray. It was where heaven and earth were understood to draw near. That is difficult for a modern mind to hold. We are used to separating categories. A palace is political. A shrine is religious. A treasury is economic. A national monument is symbolic. But in the ancient world, these things often breathed through the same doorway. The Temple of Solomon stood, in memory and tradition, as the place where divine presence could be approached through ritual. It was tied to sacrifice, priesthood, law, royal authority, and the idea that a people had been chosen, gathered, and held in covenant. Its importance was not only architectural, it was emotional and theological. It gave shape to belonging. This is why the temple's later destruction became so much more than the loss of stone. When a sanctuary is destroyed, the first wound is physical. Walls collapse. Sacred vessels are taken. Altars fall silent. People scatter. But the deeper wound comes afterward, when survivors must decide what the place means now that it is gone. A destroyed temple can disappear from the skyline. It does not disappear from memory. In fact, absence can make a sacred place more powerful. A standing building can be visited, measured, administered, argued over in practical terms. A lost building becomes harder to contain. It enters prayer, poetry, grief, politics, longing. It becomes a question no one can fully answer. Where was it exactly? What did it look like? What did its loss mean? Could it ever return? Over time, Solomon's Temple became one of history's most charged sacred memories, precisely because it was no longer available in the ordinary way. It became a symbol that different generations could carry, reinterpret, and sometimes use for purposes far removed from the world in which the first sanctuary had been imagined. For Jewish tradition, the temple remained tied to covenant, exile, mourning, and hope. For Christians, it could become a sign read through the language of prophecy, fulfillment, and sacred history. For later medieval warriors, stepping into Jerusalem after conquest, the very name of Solomon carried a weight that was older than their kingdoms and grander than their own uncertain beginnings. And here is the detail that changes the meaning of the Templar story. The knights did not attach themselves to a famous battlefield, or to the tomb of a crusading hero, or to a newly built church that celebrated their own age. They attached their identity to a vanished temple. That choice gave them a borrowed antiquity. They were new men in an old city, a fragile brotherhood in a landscape crowded with scripture. Their order had no centuries of tradition behind it, no ancestral monarchy, no ancient monastery from which to draw authority. But the Temple of Solomon did. Its name reached backward into a world of kings, priests, divine favor, sacred law, and lost glory. The power of the name did not depend on whether the knights understood every layer of the place correctly. In some ways, misunderstanding may have strengthened it. Medieval Jerusalem was a city interpreted through inherited texts, liturgy, local traditions, and crusader assumptions. Places were renamed, reimagined, and woven into Christian sacred geography. The past was not studied with modern caution. It was claimed, translated, and made useful. That does not mean everyone was lying. It means they lived inside a different way of reading place. To them, stones could testify. Ruins could confirm scripture. A building's location could feel like evidence of providence. The map of Jerusalem was not merely urban space. It was a theological argument built in limestone. So when later generations heard that the poor fellow soldiers of Christ were also of the Temple of Solomon, the imagination had very little distance to travel. If these knights lived near the temple, perhaps they guarded something. If they guarded something, perhaps it was hidden. If it was hidden, perhaps it was powerful. The logic of legend often begins with a name and lets desire do the rest. But before the myths of treasure, relics, and secret knowledge, there was a simpler and more durable fact. Solomon's temple had already become a vessel for human longing. It represented a lost order of the world, a time when kingship and holiness seemed joined, when God's presence seemed to have a house, when the center held. That is why its memory could be inherited by people who did not build it, did not see it, and may not have understood it as its earliest worshippers did. A temple made of stone can be conquered. A temple made of memory is far harder to rule. Chapter 3. The Mountain of Competing Truths. The Temple Mount is not the kind of place that can be explained from only one direction. Stand before it in memory, and the first mistake is to treat it as a single story with a single owner, a single meaning, a single wound. It has never been that simple. Its power comes partly from the fact that different traditions have looked toward the same elevated ground and seen different centers of the world. For Jewish memory, This was the place bound to the temples, first Solomon's, then the second temple that followed after exile and return. It was tied to priesthood, sacrifice, kingship, catastrophe, and hope. Even after destruction, it remained a point of orientation. A place could be physically inaccessible and still remain spiritually near. That is one of the strange laws of sacred geography. Distance does not always weaken attachment. Sometimes it sharpens it. For Christians in the medieval period, Jerusalem was read through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. The city became a landscape of fulfillment, where older scriptures were interpreted through newer revelation. The Temple Mount, like so much of Jerusalem, could be absorbed into a Christian map of meaning, not erased exactly, but relabeled through a different sacred imagination. Crusaders were not neutral visitors. They arrived with swords, prayers, expectations, and a deep conviction that holy places should confirm the truth they already believed. For Muslims, the same elevated platform had become one of Islam's most revered sanctuaries, associated with the Prophet's night journey and marked by the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. By the time the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, these were not vague landmarks. They were living holy places, woven into devotion, scholarship, rule, and memory. So the mountain was not simply ancient, it was crowded. Crowded with claims, crowded with grief, crowded with devotion, crowded with architecture that had already been interpreted and reinterpreted before the Templars ever arrived. This is where sensational stories often become lazy. They look at the Temple Mount and see only a stage for secrets, as if history were waiting politely beneath the floor for a European knight to lift the right stone. But the real complexity is more interesting than that. The site was powerful because it did not belong to fantasy. It belonged to living communities, rival memories, sacred texts, imperial ambitions, and the raw fact that conquest changes who gets to speak loudly in a holy place. Every ruler who controlled Jerusalem inherited this problem. The city could be taken by force, but its meanings could not be conquered so easily. A new regime could rename buildings, assign clergy, convert sanctuaries, and write its own ceremonies across the landscape. But beneath those acts remained older associations, not dead, not silent, merely pressed under a new layer. That is the first key to understanding the Templars' later aura. Their residence near this charged ground placed them not beside an ordinary ruin, but inside a conflict of meanings. They were not just guarding roads or pilgrims. Symbolically, whether they intended it or not, they stood near the meeting point of several sacred histories, and sacred histories do not behave like normal property. A castle can be granted, a farm can be measured, a tax can be collected, but a holy site carries emotional ownership that survives documents, treaties, and military occupation. People remember what was lost. They remember who entered. They remember who renamed. They remember who prayed there and who was prevented from praying there. The Crusaders understood some of this, but not all of it. They knew Jerusalem mattered. They knew the places of Scripture gave legitimacy to their victory. They knew that controlling the city was not merely strategic. It was spiritual theater on the largest possible scale. But they also interpreted the city through the confidence of conquerors. That confidence could flatten complexity. It could turn Islamic sanctuaries into Christian monuments, older Jewish memory into background, and contested places into trophies of providence. There is a dangerous simplicity in victory. When you win a city, it may appear to explain itself. Its gates open, its buildings are assigned, its former rulers are gone or diminished. The conqueror can mistake possession for understanding. But Jerusalem has always punished that mistake. The Temple Mount, especially, resists being reduced. It is a place where archaeology, scripture, politics, memory, and longing all press against one another. Even careful language can feel inadequate, because every term carries history inside it. Say Temple Mount, and one set of associations rises. Say Haram al-Sharif, and another comes forward. Speak of Solomon, and you enter biblical kingship. Speak of Al-Aqsa, and you enter Islamic devotion. Speak of Crusader Jerusalem, and you enter a world of conquest, conversion, and Latin Christian ambition. This does not mean all claims are identical, or that history becomes impossible to discuss. It means that the site must be approached with discipline. A storyteller has to resist the temptation to make the place serve only one mystery, because the mountain was not mysterious only because something might be hidden beneath it. It was mysterious because too much was already visible. The golden dome, the broad platform, the reused spaces, the prayers and prohibitions, the memories of destruction and triumph, the awkward closeness of reverence and violence, the way one generation's holy restoration could be another generation's desecration. That is the atmosphere into which the early Templars stepped. They entered a city where stones had biographies. A wall was not just a wall. A gate was not just an entrance. A foundation was not merely a foundation. Places carried names from scripture, from conquest, from local tradition, from misunderstanding, from hope. And when a small group of armed religious men took up residence near the site associated with Solomon's temple, their location itself became a kind of message, not necessarily a planned message. That distinction matters. We do not need to imagine the first knights sitting in secret councils, designing a myth that would echo for centuries. History is usually less tidy than that. Their first concerns were likely practical: shelter, patronage, access, protection, survival. Yet symbols have a way of growing beyond the intentions of the people who first used them. A name chosen for devotion and legitimacy can later become evidence in someone else's conspiracy. The Temple Mount made that possible. It was a place where the past never stayed politely in the past. It pressed upward. It changed the meaning of whoever stood there. To live near it was to be touched by histories older than one's own cause. To claim association with it was to borrow from a sacred account too deep to fully control. And that is why the Templar's story cannot begin with treasure. It begins with proximity, a handful of knights near a mountain of competing truths, and a world ready to believe that such closeness must have given them more than a roof over their heads. Chapter 4. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders. In the summer of 1099, Jerusalem changed hands in a way that would mark the imagination of Europe for centuries. The First Crusade had begun as a call to arms, a pilgrimage under weapons, a movement of nobles, knights, clerics, peasants, ambition, fear, and religious longing. By the time its survivors reached Jerusalem, the journey had already hardened them. They had crossed hostile lands, endured hunger, disease, rivalries, and sieges. Some had come seeking salvation. Some came seeking land. Many probably carried motives too tangled to separate cleanly. That is one of the difficult truths about the Crusades. They were not only wars of faith, and not only wars of greed. They were both, and more than both. Medieval people did not always divide spiritual desire from worldly violence in the way we might wish they had. A man could believe he was serving God while also seeking honor, wealth, pardon, or a place in history. The human soul has rarely been tidy. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, they did not merely take a city. They entered a sacred map. To them, Jerusalem was the place where Christ had suffered, died, and risen. It was the city of prophecy, pilgrimage, relics, and redemption. Its recovery felt, to Latin Christian eyes, like a cosmic event, not just a military success, but a sign that heaven had leaned toward their cause. And that belief mattered. It shaped what they did with the city afterward. The Crusader kingdom that emerged from the conquest inherited streets, walls, shrines, mosques, churches, memories, and communities that did not fit neatly into its own story. Jerusalem was already layered with Jewish, Christian, and Islamic meaning, but the conquerors approached it through the lens of victory. They organized the city as a Christian capital. They transformed sacred buildings. They attached Latin clergy to holy places. They converted Islamic sanctuaries into spaces that served Christian rule and devotion. This was not unusual for conquerors in the medieval world. Rulers often marked victory by reassigning sacred architecture. A building was never just useful shelter. It was a declaration. To pray where another community had prayed was to announce that power had shifted, that history had been corrected. Tatwu, or so the conqueror believed, had chosen a side. But Jerusalem made every such act louder. On the Temple Mount, the Crusaders encountered structures of immense beauty and significance, though they interpreted them through their own traditions. The Dome of the Rock became associated in Latin Christian usage with the Temple of the Lord. Al-Aqsa Mosque, near the southern side of the platform, became linked to Solomon's temple and royal memory. These identifications were not careful archaeology. They were acts of sacred translation, attempts to make the city's buildings speak the language of the new rulers. It is easy to mock this from a distance. A modern observer can point out confusion, appropriation, and error, but it is more useful to understand the mental world at work. The Crusaders came from a culture where scripture was not dead text, but living geography. They expected holy history to have locations. They expected buildings and stones to confirm the stories that had drawn them across the world. When they saw grand architecture on the platform of the ancient temple, they fitted it into the framework they knew. Possession became interpretation. That is the atmosphere in which the future Templars would appear. The city had been remade, but not made simple. New Christian meanings were laid over older Muslim sanctuaries and ancient Jewish memory. The Crusaders could crown rulers, hold processions, and rename buildings, but they could not erase the complexity under their feet. They had created a Latin kingdom in a city where every triumph carried an unresolved echo. For the new rulers, sacred geography served legitimacy. A fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies needed more than walls and soldiers. It needed a story strong enough to justify its existence. Jerusalem gave them that story. To rule, there was to stand inside biblical time. To control its holy places was to claim guardianship over the most important landscape in Christian memory. But guardianship is a complicated word when it follows conquest. The Crusaders saw themselves as defenders of holy places and protectors of pilgrims. Others experienced them as invaders. Both realities shaped what came next. The roads to Jerusalem were dangerous. Pilgrims still needed protection. The kingdom needed military strength. The city needed institutions that could turn religious enthusiasm into lasting structure. And here the story begins to narrow from armies to a handful of men. After the conquest, Jerusalem did not become peaceful simply because it had become Christian-ruled. The Latin kingdom was exposed, thinly held, and dependent on constant movement between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrims arrived with devotion, but not always with weapons or knowledge of the land. The routes between ports and holy sites could be perilous. A new kind of problem had appeared: how to defend a pilgrimage world after the great crusading army had gone home or settled into lordship. This is one reason the Templars should not be introduced as if they appeared from nowhere, already wrapped in mystery. Their birth was practical before it was legendary. They emerged from a real need inside a new and vulnerable crusader society. Yet the setting made them unusual from the start. Had a small brotherhood of knights formed in some ordinary frontier castle, history might have remembered them as one more military fraternity among many. But these men rose in Jerusalem, under the shadow of sites associated with the Bible, beside a platform that carried centuries of sacred memory. Their mission was practical. Their location made it symbolic. That combination is the seed of everything. Practical institutions can become myths when they are born in mythic places. A guard post becomes a sacred trust. A residence becomes a clue. A name becomes an inheritance. The Crusader conquest did not create the memory of Solomon's temple, but it placed Latin Christian warriors in a position to adopt and reshape that memory for their own age. Jerusalem, after 1099, was therefore more than a captured prize. It was a machine for producing meaning. Every procession, every converted sanctuary, every royal ceremony, every armed pilgrim passing through its gates added another layer to the story the Crusaders told about themselves. And soon, near the place they believed touched the world of Solomon, a poor band of knights would take up a task that sounded humble enough: protect the pilgrims. History would remember the address almost as much as the mission. Chapter 5. The poor knights arrive. The men who would become the Templars did not first appear as masters of castles, bankers to kings, or keepers of forbidden knowledge. They began much smaller than that. The traditional story places their origins in the years after Jerusalem's conquest, when a knight named Jacques de Molay and a small group of companions pledged themselves to the protection of Christian pilgrims. These pilgrims had crossed the sea or traveled overland because Jerusalem, in Latin Christian imagination, had become the heart of the world. To reach it was an act of devotion. To survive the road, there was not always guaranteed. That is the plain beginning. A road, a vow, a handful of armed men. It is almost disappointingly practical, which may be why later legend worked so hard to decorate it. The early Templars were not yet the vast institution that would one day hold estates across Europe. They were not yet famous enough to be feared. They were not yet accused of secret rites or hidden corruption. They were, at least in their own presentation, poor knights offering protection in a dangerous landscape. But even here, the simplicity is deceptive. A knight was not a monk. A monk was not a knight. Medieval society had categories, and these men stood awkwardly between them. They carried weapons, yet spoke the language of religious service. They were trained for violence, yet claimed a life of discipline and devotion. They were poor, or at least pledged to poverty, yet they operated in one of the most symbolically expensive places on earth. Their poverty mattered. not because poverty made them harmless, but because it gave their violence a different face. A mercenary fought for pay. A noble fought for honor, land, or obligation. A crusader fought under a vow, often for salvation as much as victory. But these knights proposed something more permanent. A life in which the sword itself could become part of religious obedience. That was a radical idea. It did not remove the brutality of warfare. It did not make killing clean, but it did change how supporters could imagine the men who fought. They were not simply warriors passing through the Holy Land on campaign. They were protectors rooted there, men whose daily discipline could be described as service to Christ. There is a tension here that should not be smoothed away. The early Templars were born from devotion and danger, but also from the contradictions of Crusader society. The kingdom needed soldiers. Pilgrims needed escorts. The church needed a way to think about sanctified violence without admitting too openly how strange that idea was. The Templars offered a living answer, uncomfortable, useful, and powerful. They were poor, they were armed, they were religious, they were necessary. That combination gave them a kind of moral charge. It made them appear humble and formidable at the same time. A barefoot pilgrim might see protection. A ruler might see useful manpower. A bishop might see disciplined zeal. A critic might already see the beginning of a dangerous confusion, prayer wearing armor. Hugues de Payens himself remains in some ways a shadowed figure, not because he was imaginary, but because the early years of the order are not documented with the fullness we might want. Later memory knows what the Templars became and reads backward, trying to find signs of greatness from the start. But the beginning was likely fragile. Their numbers were small. Their resources were limited. Their mission depended on patronage and approval. Without support, they could have vanished as easily as many other pious experiments of the age. This is important. The Templars were not inevitable. History often makes institutions look destined once they have survived long enough. We look at the later order, wealthy, exempt, international, feared, and assume the seed already contained the empire. But in those first years, the future was not guaranteed. The small brotherhood could have failed through poverty, politics, death, or simple irrelevance. Instead, they found a place in the new order of Jerusalem, and the place mattered almost as much as the pledge. The early knights received support from the rulers of the Crusader kingdom, including quarters connected to the area of the former royal palace on the Temple Mount. In Crusader understanding, this placed them near the site associated with Solomon's temple. Whether every association was historically precise is not the point. What matters is what the location meant to the people who granted it, inhabited it, and later heard about it. A poor order of knights might have been admired. A poor order of knights living by the Temple of Solomon became unforgettable. This is where atmosphere begins to gather around them. Imagine the contrast. Men who claimed humility residing beside one of the most charged, sacred landscapes in the world. Their clothing may have been plain, their resources limited, their order still young, yet their address connected them to biblical kingship, vanished holiness, and the ancient memory of divine presence. No wonder the imagination later refused to leave them alone. But we should be careful. Proximity is not proof of discovery. Living near a sacred site does not mean digging beneath it. Possessing rooms near old foundations does not mean uncovering treasure. A symbolic address can become suspicious only when later generations decide that symbols must conceal facts. Still, it is easy to understand why the suspicion survived. The Templars entered history at a point where practical necessity and sacred geography overlapped almost too perfectly. They protected pilgrims, but lived near the memory of the temple. They called themselves poor, but stood beside a name associated with ancient splendor. They served the church, yet developed an identity that would soon stretch beyond local control. At first, the mystery was not what they had found. The mystery was what they represented. They were a new type of Christian warrior in a conquered holy city, standing at the edge of older memories they had inherited but not created. Their lives were shaped by real dangers, real roads, real vows. Yet from the beginning, their story had more symbolic weight than any small brotherhood could easily carry. And perhaps that is why the Templars became so vulnerable to legend. They did not need to invent mystery. Jerusalem supplied it. The temple supplied it. Their poverty supplied it. Their swords supplied it. Their silence, where records are thin, supplied the rest. A small band of men arrived to protect pilgrims, but they settled beside a memory too large to remain practical for long. Chapter 6. The palace beside the ruins. The place given to the early knights was not just shelter. That is the first thing to understand. In a new and unstable kingdom, a roof mattered. A secure residence near the heart of Jerusalem mattered even more. But the quarters associated with the early Templars carried a meaning that no ordinary barracks could have offered. They were connected with the former royal palace on the Temple Mount, near structures the Crusaders associated with Solomon's temple. In practical terms, this gave the knights proximity to power. In symbolic terms, it gave them a kind of sacred address, and sacred addresses have a way of becoming stories. To medieval eyes, the arrangement could seem almost providential. Here were poor knights of Christ, sworn to defend pilgrims, living beside the memory of the wisest king of Israel. Solomon's name was not neutral. It suggested judgment, wealth, temple building, divine favor, and ancient authority. Even if the Crusader identifications of the site were shaped by misunderstanding and inherited tradition, the symbolism was potent. The knights did not need marble halls to appear significant. The location did the work. There is a temptation, especially in modern retellings, to turn this moment into the opening scene of a treasure hunt. The knights receive rooms near the Temple Mount. Therefore, they must have searched beneath it. They live beside ancient foundations. Therefore, they must have found something. The story almost writes itself, which is precisely why we should be careful with it. History does not become evidence simply because it is cinematic. What we can say with more confidence is that the early Templars lived close to one of the most symbolically powerful sites in medieval Jerusalem. Their quarters were linked, in Crusader thought, to the Temple of Solomon. Their daily life unfolded beside a place already layered with Jewish memory, Islamic sanctity, and Christian reinterpretation. That alone was enough to change how people understood them. A building can grant more than space. It can grant association. Think of the difference between a guard stationed at a city gate and a guard stationed beside a royal tomb. The work may be similar. The meaning is not. One protects movement. The other appears to protect memory. The Templars' residence placed them in a position where their mission could be imagined as larger than road security. They seemed to stand watch beside the inheritance of biblical history. That does not mean they were guarding the original temple. It means they were living beside what the Crusaders believed and named as temple space. In medieval Jerusalem, belief and naming had real force. A place identified with Solomon became, for Latin Christians, part of a sacred geography that could authorize institutions, rituals, and claims of legitimacy. The knights benefited from that atmosphere, whether by design or by accident. Inside such a residence, daily life may have been less glamorous than legend allows. Men needed food, weapons, horses, repairs, discipline, orders, and sleep. They had to maintain equipment, escort travelers, obey superiors, and survive the ordinary frictions of communal religious life. A place later wrapped in mystery may at the time have smelled more of leather, sweat, animals, damp cloth, and cooked grain than incense and buried gold. That contrast is useful. It reminds us that myths often grow from a distance. The later imagination sees Templars on the Temple Mount and pictures secret vaults. The men themselves may have seen a hard assignment, a useful patron, a sacred duty, and a precarious future. Still, secrecy entered the story naturally, not necessarily because they possessed hidden things, but because their setting encouraged hidden meanings. The Temple Mount was a place where absence felt active. The first temple was gone. The second temple was gone. The buildings that stood there belonged to other histories and had been reinterpreted by conquest. Beneath every visible layer lay the memory of another. In such a place, even ordinary silence could become suspicious. The early records do not give us a detailed diary of what the knights did in their quarters. They do not provide a neat map of every room, every conversation, every passageway, every repair. That absence leaves room for speculation. But absence is not a blank check. A missing record can mean loss, neglect, routine, or simple lack of interest from chroniclers. It does not automatically mean concealment. This is one of the central disciplines in telling the Templar story. To let mystery remain mystery without pretending it has already confessed. The palace beside the ruins gave the order an atmosphere of sacred inheritance. It placed them near a site charged with memory, and later generations would ask whether they had discovered something there. But the more historically grounded question may be subtler. What did living there do to them? It gave them a name. It gave them a stage. It gave them proximity to the king, to the holy city, and to a biblical past that no young institution could have manufactured on its own. That proximity helped transform a small brotherhood into something legible to medieval Christendom. They were not merely armed escorts. They were the knights of the temple. The phrase itself carried architecture, scripture, and authority inside it. People far away in France, England, Italy, or Spain did not need to see the rooms. They only needed to hear the name. And once the name traveled, the site traveled with it. The Temple Mount became portable in imagination. A knight could stand in a European commandery, far from Jerusalem, and still belong to an order whose identity pointed back to Solomon's temple. Donations made in distant villages could be linked, spiritually and symbolically, to the defense of the Holy Land. Land, money, and devotion could flow toward an institution whose center seemed to touch biblical antiquity. That was the true power of the palace beside the ruins. Not that it proves a discovery beneath the stones, but that it allowed a fragile military brotherhood to clothe itself in sacred memory. The Templars inherited a location they did not fully control, in a city they did not fully understand, beside a temple that no longer stood. From those fragments came one of the strongest identities of the medieval world. A roof became a residence became a name, and a name became a legend sturdy enough to survive the order's own destruction. Chapter 7. Why the name mattered. Names are never innocent in a sacred city. They can sound simple, even administrative, until you notice what they are trying to carry. The Templars' full early identity, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, was not a casual label. It was almost a miniature theology. Poverty, fellowship, warfare, Christ, and Solomon's temple were all placed inside one title, as if the order were asking the medieval world to understand several contradictions at once. Poor but armed, humble but knightly, new but tied to antiquity, servants of Christ but named for the temple of an ancient king. That name did not merely describe where they lived. It explained who they were supposed to be. The first part, poor fellow soldiers of Christ, gave the brotherhood a language of humility and devotion. These were not meant to be ordinary fighting men selling violence to the highest bidder. They were fellow soldiers, bound together, serving a religious mission. The word poor mattered because it separated them from the worldly image of knightly ambition. The hunger for land, ransom, fine clothing, household prestige, and inheritance. Of course, the later history of the order would make that word sound almost ironic. The Templars would become wealthy, powerful, and deeply involved in finance. But at the beginning, poverty was not decoration. It was part of the moral argument. A knight who renounced personal wealth could be presented as less corrupted by the usual motives of war. His sword, at least in theory, belonged to obedience, but the second part of the name did something even more powerful, of the Temple of Solomon. Those words pulled the order out of the ordinary present and placed it under the long shadow of biblical kingship. Solomon was not just any king. In tradition, he was the builder of the temple, the ruler associated with wisdom, splendor, judgment, and divine favor. To be connected with his temple was to stand beside one of the most potent symbols in sacred history. For a young order, that was an extraordinary inheritance. The Templars did not have an ancient founder from the Desert Fathers. They did not descend from an old monastic tradition with centuries of saints behind it. They were a strange new experiment, and strange new experiments often need strong names to survive. By binding themselves to the Temple of Solomon, they gained a sense of depth that their short history could not yet provide. This is where the name becomes more than branding, though branding is not the worst modern comparison. Medieval institutions understood the importance of association. A monastery might be tied to a saint. A relic might draw pilgrims. A cathedral might anchor civic pride. A royal dynasty might wrap itself in prophecy or ancestry. Legitimacy was not only enforced by law, it was narrated. The Templars' name narrated them beautifully. It said, "These men are not merely guards on dangerous roads. They belong to the holy city. They stand in relation to the ancient temple. Their mission is not local police work, but service within the grand story of salvation history." That did not make every claim historically precise. The Crusader understanding of the Temple Mount was layered with religious interpretation, inherited assumptions, and practical reuse of buildings. But medieval power did not always require precision. It required recognition. People heard Temple of Solomon, and they understood importance. The name gave the order a kind of sacred compression. In a few words, it gathered the memory of Israel's king, the vanished sanctuary, Christian devotion, armed pilgrimage, and the defense of Jerusalem. It made the Templars sound older than they were, and sounding old mattered. In the medieval world, age could imply truth. The ancient was often closer to the sacred, closer to origins, closer to God's first designs. A new group had to justify itself. An ancient inheritance seemed already justified. By adopting the temple into their identity, the Templars appeared not to invent something new, but to restore, guard, or continue something venerable. This is one reason their later legend became so persistent. The name created a question that refused to die. If they were of the temple, what did that mean? Did it mean residence, devotion, symbolic inheritance, guardianship, knowledge, discovery? Historically, the safest answer begins with residence and association. They received quarters connected to the Temple Mount, and the name reflected that connection. But names invite expansion. Once repeated across Europe, detached from the actual rooms and the messy realities of Crusader Jerusalem, the phrase could become larger than its origin. A donor in Champagne or Flanders did not need to know the architectural details of the platform. He did not need to understand the competing Jewish, Christian, and Islamic meanings of the site. He needed only to believe that giving to the Templars meant supporting men linked to the holiest city and to the memory of the ancient temple. The name carried Jerusalem into Europe. It transformed distant estates into part of a sacred network. A farm field in the west could support horses in the east. A coin given in a village church could be imagined as helping protect pilgrims near the places of Scripture. Through the name, the order made geography devotional. But there was a cost. A powerful name can protect an institution, but it can also trap it. The more the Templars became associated with sacred mystery, the more their silence and independence could be interpreted darkly. The name that once gave them legitimacy later gave their enemies material. If they were men of the temple, perhaps they had temple secrets. If they were secretive, perhaps those secrets were corrupt. If they were wealthy, perhaps the wealth came from something hidden rather than from donations, land management, and financial skill. The accusation did not have to be logical. It only had to feel plausible to people already prepared to distrust them. That is the danger of symbolic power. It does not remain obedient to the people who first claim it. The Templars used the Temple of Solomon to define themselves as sacred warriors in service to Christ. Later generations used the same connection to imagine buried treasure, forbidden knowledge, lost relics, and underground continuities. Their name became a doorway, and almost anyone could walk through it carrying their own theory. Yet the historical core remains more revealing than the fantasy. The Templars chose, or accepted, an identity that fused military service with the memory of a vanished sanctuary. That fusion gave them authority, poetry, and danger. It helped a small order appear vast before it was vast. It turned practical protection into sacred vocation. It made their poverty seem noble, their violence seem disciplined, and their residence seem ordained by history. The temple itself was gone, but its name still had work to do, and in the hands of the Templars, that name became one of the most powerful pieces of medieval inheritance ever claimed by men with swords. Chapter 8. Monks with swords. A monk was expected to withdraw from the world. A knight was expected to enter it violently. The Templars forced these two ideas into the same body. That is what made them so unsettling and so useful. They were not simply religious men who admired soldiers from a distance, and they were not ordinary warriors who paid for prayers after battle. Their identity asked medieval Christendom to accept a new possibility, that a man could live under religious discipline and still carry a sword as part of his vocation. It sounds familiar now because history has made the Templars famous. But at the time, the combination was not comfortable. The traditional religious life was built around obedience, chastity, poverty, prayer, fasting, humility, and withdrawal from worldly ambition. The knightly life was built around rank, weapons, horses, loyalty, reputation, and the controlled use of violence. One life trained a man to kneel, the other trained him to charge. The Templars did both. This does not mean they solved the contradiction. They institutionalized it. That distinction matters. A contradiction does not disappear because a rule is written around it. The early Templar ideal tried to discipline violence by enclosing it within vows. The sword was not supposed to serve private anger, greed, or vanity. It was to serve a sacred mission: the protection of pilgrims and the defense of the Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land. But violence, even disciplined violence, remains violence. That is the uncomfortable center of the order. Their supporters could describe them as holy warriors. Their enemies could see them as armed monks who had crossed a line. Both reactions make sense. The Templars emerged from a world trying to reconcile Christian ideals of humility and peace with the brutal necessities of crusading warfare. They were not an accidental contradiction. They were the answer to a problem the age had created for itself. The Church had long wrestled with the morality of war. Knights could be condemned for plunder, private feuds, cruelty, and pride. Yet they were also needed by rulers and bishops alike. The Crusades intensified the question. If fighting for Jerusalem could be framed as penitential and sacred, then perhaps the warrior himself could be reshaped into something more obedient, less worldly, more spiritually directed. The Templars embodied that hope. They lived communally. They followed a rule. They submitted to command. They renounced ordinary family life. They were expected to obey, to pray, to keep discipline, to accept hardship, and to place the mission above personal glory. In theory, this made them different from the knight seeking songs, ransom, or estates. A Templar was not supposed to fight for himself, in theory. The phrase matters because institutions are made of humans, not ideals. Some men surely lived the vocation with sincerity. Others may have been drawn by status, adventure, pressure, or lack of better prospects. Some were disciplined. Some were probably difficult. A religious rule can shape behavior, but it cannot erase ambition, fear, exhaustion, resentment, or pride. This is where the Templars become more human than their legend allows. They were not marble statues of devotion, and they were not cartoon villains in white mantles. They were men living inside a demanding structure, asked to combine prayer and military readiness, obedience and aggression, humility and elite skill. They inhabited one of the hardest psychological spaces in medieval life. To be told that the thing most dangerous in you could become holy if properly governed. That idea had power. It also had risk. A warrior who believes he serves a sacred cause can endure extraordinary hardship. He can also become difficult to restrain if he believes ordinary rules do not fully apply to him. The Templar system tried to manage that danger through discipline. The individual knight was not meant to be a wandering hero. He was part of a corporate body. His courage belonged to the order. His obedience mattered as much as his bravery. This may be one of the least glamorous secrets of Templar strength. Not hidden relics, but structure. A knight fighting for personal fame is unpredictable. A knight under religious command can be deployed, transferred, punished, coordinated, and made part of a long-term strategy. The order turned aristocratic violence into institutional force. It took the skills of the mounted warrior and placed them inside an organization that could survive beyond one man's death. That was new enough to matter. The Templars also changed the spiritual image of knighthood. In an earlier moral imagination, the knight was often a problem to be corrected, too proud, too violent, too attached to wealth. The Templar ideal suggested that knighthood itself might be redeemed, not by softening it into something harmless, but by redirecting it toward a sanctified purpose. There is something deeply medieval in that solution. Modern people often imagine reform as removing violence. The Templar model imagined reform as consecrating and controlling it. That difference tells us a great deal about the world that produced them. Their clothing captured the tension. The image of the Templar mantle, plain, religious, marked by the cross in later iconography, became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Middle Ages. But beneath the image was a harder reality. Armor, horses, weapons, wounds, logistics, and fear. They prayed, but they also trained. They fasted, but they also rode into combat. They renounced personal luxury, yet belonged to an order that would come to command immense resources. Humility and power stood side by side, neither fully canceling the other. That tension helped make them admired. It also helped make them suspect. People can tolerate wealth in a noble. They expect it. They can tolerate poverty in a monk. They admire it. But poverty joined to military power creates unease. A man who claims to own nothing, yet belongs to a body that owns castles and moves money across borders, is difficult to categorize. A man who kneels in prayer and then rises to kill under command forces observers to decide which image is the real one. The Templars never stopped producing that question. Were they monks who fought? Or soldiers who had learned to speak the language of monks? The historical answer is probably less neat than either option. They were a new kind of institution built for a new kind of crusading world. Their religious discipline was real. Their military function was real. Their ideals were sincere enough to inspire support and compromised enough to invite criticism. They were both devotion and force, prayer and policy, sacrifice and strategy. That complexity is more revealing than the legend. Because the true shock of the Templars was not that they may have hidden something beneath the Temple Mount. It was that they made a holy life out of permanent readiness for war. They took the monastery's obedience and the battlefield's violence, then bound them together under one rule. And once that idea received approval, it could grow far beyond a handful of poor knights in Jerusalem. The world had been shown a new instrument, the disciplined sacred warrior, not passing through on crusade but organized, funded, and waiting. Chapter 9. The Church gives its blessing. An idea can be intense and still remain fragile. For the early Templars, devotion was not enough. Courage was not enough. Even a useful mission could fade if it lacked recognition from the powers that shaped medieval Christendom. A few knights protecting pilgrims might be admired locally, but admiration does not build an order. It does not secure donations, recruit men, silence critics, or turn an experiment into an institution. For that, the Templars needed blessing, not just a kind word, not just tolerance. They needed the Church to look at this strange fusion of monk and warrior and say, in effect, this life is legitimate. That approval did not come in a vacuum. The Latin East needed defenders. Pilgrimage routes needed protection. The Crusader states were difficult to hold, and enthusiasm in Europe had to be organized into something more durable than one expedition at a time. A permanent military religious order offered a solution to several problems at once. It could channel nightly violence, reassure donors, strengthen Jerusalem, and give pious warfare a disciplined form. Still, the idea required careful explanation. One of the most important voices in that explanation was Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose influence reached far beyond his monastery. Bernard was not a minor enthusiast adding applause from the sidelines. He was one of the commanding spiritual figures of his age, a man whose support could help make a controversial idea respectable. When he defended the Templars, he helped frame them not as men divided between holiness and violence, but as warriors whose violence had been redirected toward a sacred duty. That framing mattered enormously. The Templars did not merely need soldiers, they needed a story that made their soldiers spiritually intelligible. Bernard and other supporters helped provide it. The knight who fought for vanity or plunder could be condemned. The knight who fought under obedience for the defense of pilgrims and holy places could be praised as a different kind of figure, not because bloodshed had become harmless, but because intention, discipline, and mission were believed to transform its moral meaning. Modern listeners may find that argument difficult. We should not soften it too much. The blessing of the Templars shows how deeply medieval Christianity could wrestle with violence while also making room for it. The Church did not simply stumble into endorsing armed religion. It developed language, categories, and ideals that could make such a life seem not only acceptable, but spiritually elevated. This was powerful. It was also dangerous. Once the Templars received recognition, they became more than a local brotherhood. They became part of the machinery of Latin Christendom. Church support gave them credibility in sermons, councils, courts, and noble households. It encouraged gifts. It helped recruitment. It gave anxious families a way to imagine a son's military life as sacrifice rather than mere danger. It allowed donors to connect their wealth to the defense of Jerusalem without leaving home. A sanctioned order could travel in ways an unsanctioned fraternity could not. Its reputation moved ahead of it. A lord hearing of the Templars did not hear only of armed men in the East. He heard of a religious institution approved by authority, praised by respected voices, and tied to the holiest city in Christian memory. That combination opened doors. Land could be given, money could be entrusted, young men could be sent, privileges could be granted. The blessing also changed the internal meaning of obedience. A Templar did not merely serve a charismatic founder or a temporary military band. He belonged to a recognized religious order, with a rule, hierarchy, discipline, and purpose. The personal vow became part of a larger structure, and the structure made the vow durable. This is how small movements survive their founders. The Church's approval also helped manage the central contradiction we saw earlier: prayer and bloodshed, poverty and power, humility and command. It did not erase the contradiction. It gave people permission to live with it. That may be the most honest way to describe what happened. The Templars were not made simple by ecclesiastical blessing. They were made usable, and medieval Europe quickly learned how useful they could be. A noble might donate to them for salvation, prestige, family strategy, or genuine devotion. A ruler might value them as disciplined fighters beyond ordinary feudal obligations. Clergy could promote them as defenders of pilgrims and Christian holy places. Pilgrims could see them as protection on roads where piety alone did not stop an ambush. Different groups saw different advantages, and the order stood at the intersection of all of them. This is where spiritual prestige turned practical. The Templars' mission gave donors a reason to give. Their discipline gave donors confidence. Their church recognition made giving safe. Their link to Jerusalem made giving emotionally powerful. Their name, tied to the Temple of Solomon, made giving feel ancient and sacred. Even when the donation was a very earthly parcel of land, a mill, a vineyard, a rent, or a chest of coins. Institutions grow when symbolism and administration cooperate. The Templars had both. We should notice something else. The Church's blessing did not only protect the Templars from outside doubt, it helped create the high expectations that would later haunt them. When an institution claims sacred purpose, people judge its failures more harshly. A corrupt noble is disappointing. A corrupt holy warrior is scandalous. A wealthy merchant is ordinary. A wealthy order sworn to poverty looks suspicious. A secretive political body may be resented. A secretive religious body may be feared. The approval that elevated the Templars also raised the height from which they could fall. For now, though, the effect was expansion. The fragile experiment had become legitimate. The awkward idea of monks with swords had been translated into a language medieval Christendom could understand. The Templars were no longer merely a few men in Jerusalem trying to survive the dangers of pilgrimage roads. They were becoming a recognized vessel for devotion, violence, money, land, and hope. Bernard's support did not create them out of nothing. The roads were dangerous before he wrote. The Crusader kingdom needed defenders before churchmen praised the order. But his influence helped give the Templars moral architecture. He helped make their contradiction appear purposeful. And once contradiction becomes purpose, it can inspire extraordinary loyalty. It can also hide extraordinary ambition. The blessing of the Church placed the Templars inside the sacred order of medieval society. It gave them spiritual prestige and practical influence. It turned a risky experiment into something that could be preached, funded, copied, and defended. The poor knights had found more than a residence near the temple. They had found authorization, and with authorization, poverty could begin its long transformation into power. Chapter 10. The temple becomes an empire. Power does not always announce itself with a crown. Sometimes it arrives as a gift of land, a vineyard, a mill, a field, a farmhouse, a rent owed each year, a chest of coins offered for the soul of a parent, a husband, a son, or the donor himself. The Templars did not become powerful only because they fought in the East. They became powerful because thousands of practical decisions scattered across Europe slowly fed one institution. This is where the story leaves the narrow streets of Jerusalem and spreads outward. Once the Church blessed the order and nobles began to trust its mission, the Templars became a channel through which devotion could be made material. A person who would never see Jerusalem could still support its defense. A family anxious about salvation could give property to men who carried the prestige of pilgrimage, monastic discipline, and holy war. The donation might be local, but the meaning was international. That was one of the order's greatest strengths. It could make a field in France feel connected to the Holy Land. Across Europe, Templar houses and commanderies formed a network of administration. These were not always dramatic fortresses perched over deserts. Many were working estates. They managed agriculture, collected rents, cared for horses, stored goods, received donations, and organized resources. Their power was built as much in ledgers and barns as in castles and battles. That may sound less mysterious than buried treasure, but it is far more revealing. A medieval military order needed money constantly. Horses were expensive. Armor was expensive. Ships, weapons, food, garrisons, repairs, ransom, diplomacy, and fortified positions all devoured resources. Heroic images of knights charging beneath a cross can hide the less romantic truth. War is an administrative appetite. It eats grain, metal, leather, timber, coin, and men. The Templars learned to feed it. Their European estates helped support their military role in the Holy Land. Their castles and strongholds in the eastern Mediterranean helped anchor Crusader defense. Their disciplined organization allowed resources to move across distance with unusual reliability. Over time, they became not merely warriors, but managers of a trans-regional system. This is the moment when Poor Knights begins to sound like a memory from another world. The order's individual members might still be bound by vows, but the corporation itself became wealthy. That distinction is important. A Templar brother did not personally own the order's estates, but he belonged to a body that could own, collect, lend, build, and negotiate. Poverty at the individual level could coexist with enormous institutional wealth. To modern ears, that sounds like a loophole. To medieval religious life, it was not unique. Monasteries, too, could be wealthy while monks personally owned nothing. But the Templars added something sharper to the arrangement. They were armed, mobile, exempt from many local pressures, and tied to an international mission. Wealth in a cloister could provoke criticism. Wealth in the hands of disciplined holy warriors could provoke awe, and eventually fear. The order also developed a reputation for financial trust. Pilgrims, nobles, and rulers could deposit valuables with Templar houses and draw on the order's network elsewhere. The details varied, and we should avoid turning them into a modern bank in white mantles. But their administrative reliability, geographic reach, and legal privileges made them unusually useful in a world where moving money was dangerous. A coin could be stolen. A letter of credit, handled by a trusted network, was harder to ambush on a road. Here again, the real secret is not fantasy. It is infrastructure. The Templars became powerful because they built systems, commanderies, records, personnel, discipline, routes, fortified houses, relationships with rulers, and habits of trust. Their strength lay in being both sacred and practical. They could receive gifts in the language of salvation, then convert those gifts into horses, walls, supplies, and credit. That combination is almost more unsettling than any legend of a hidden relic. A relic may inspire belief. A system can change politics. By the mid and later years of their existence, the Templars were woven into the lives of kings and nobles across Christendom. They held property in many regions. They defended castles in the east. They advised, financed, transported, and negotiated. They were visible everywhere, and yet, because of their internal discipline, not fully transparent to outsiders. This is when admiration begins to cast a shadow. People tend to trust institutions while they seem useful and morally elevated. But when those institutions become wealthy, independent, and difficult to control, trust begins to curdle. The Templars' success created the conditions for suspicion. Their estates could be envied. Their privileges could be resented. Their secrecy, once seen as religious discipline, could be read as concealment. Their international identity, once a strength, could look like a refusal to belong to any local authority. The empire of the Temple was not an empire in the ordinary sense. It had no royal dynasty, no single national territory, no crown passed from father to son. It was a religious military network held together by vows, rule, hierarchy, property, and mission. But in practical terms, it moved through the medieval world with a reach few secular lords could match. That made it difficult to categorize. A king could understand another king. A bishop could understand another bishop. A merchant could understand another merchant, but the Templars were harder. Monks who fought, warriors who prayed, landholders who claimed poverty, financial agents who spoke the language of sacrifice, subjects of Christendom who often seemed answerable to powers beyond the local ruler standing in front of them. Their power was not only what they owned, it was what they were allowed to be. This is why the rise of the Templars should not be told as simple corruption, as if poor knights woke one morning and decided to become rich. The transformation was gradual, and much of it came from the very success of their mission. People gave because they believed. Rulers supported them because they were useful. The church privileged them because their role served a larger crusading project. The order expanded because the world around it kept feeding it with land, trust, and expectation. But every gift increased the distance between image and reality. The image remained the poor soldier of Christ. The reality became castles, estates, archives, commanders, ships, treasuries, and debts owed by powerful men. A contradiction can inspire people while it is young. When it grows rich, the same contradiction starts to look like hypocrisy. And somewhere inside that slow change, the temple became an empire, not by discovering a secret beneath Jerusalem, but by mastering the visible machinery of medieval power so well that later generations found ordinary explanations too small. Chapter 11. What did they find? At some point, almost every story about the Templars returns to the same tempting question. What did they find? It is the question that turns a military order into a legend. It takes the early knights from their quarters near the Temple Mount and sends them downward, into tunnels, chambers, hidden archives, buried relics, forbidden knowledge, or treasure left behind by vanished kings. It is a question built for candlelight and suspicion. It is also a question that has often been answered far too confidently. The evidence is thinner here. That does not mean the question is foolish. The Templars really did live near one of the most symbolically charged sites in the medieval world. They really did take their name from the Temple of Solomon. The Temple Mount really did carry layers of memory, conquest, construction, destruction, and sacred association. And the early years of the order are not documented in the kind of detail that would satisfy modern curiosity. Those facts create space. Legend moves into space very easily. Later stories imagined that the knights discovered relics beneath the mount. Perhaps treasure from Solomon's temple, perhaps sacred vessels, perhaps documents that could shake the church, perhaps the Holy Grail, perhaps knowledge passed down from some older hidden tradition. The list changes depending on the century and the storyteller. A legend is rarely loyal to one version of itself. It survives by changing clothes, but what can we actually say? We can say that the Templars' location encouraged speculation. A young order of armed religious men living near a site associated with the biblical temple was bound to attract imaginative attention. We can say that their later wealth made people wonder whether ordinary donations and administration could really explain their rise. We can say that their internal discipline and limited transparency helped make outsiders suspicious. We can say that after their destruction, unanswered questions became easier to fill with dramatic answers. What we cannot honestly say is that they discovered a hidden relic or secret archive beneath the Temple Mount. There is no solid historical proof for that. And this is where the story becomes more interesting, not less. Because the endurance of the legend tells us something powerful about how people treat silence. When records are incomplete, we do not simply accept incompleteness. We start arranging the gaps into patterns. We ask why a document is missing, why a brotherhood grew quickly, why a name was chosen, why a powerful order became feared. Then, quietly, the word maybe becomes surely. Maybe they found something. Surely they found something. There is a whole world between those two sentences. The Templar myth often lives in that space. The Temple Mount itself magnified the effect. This was not just any old site. It was associated with vanished sanctuaries, divine presence, royal authority, and sacred loss. To imagine something hidden beneath it felt almost natural. The place already seemed to contain more history than could be seen. Its visible buildings were only the latest layer. Beneath them, spiritually, if not literally, lay the memory of temples, conquest, worship, grief, and longing. So when people later asked what the Templars found, they were also asking what the mountain was still keeping from the world. That question has a strange emotional appeal. It suggests that history is not truly gone, only concealed. It offers the hope that a lost sacred order might still be recoverable in physical form. A chest, a scroll, a cup, a chamber, a sign. For viewers of history, this is deeply seductive. Evidence is patient. Treasure is immediate. A document needs interpretation. A relic seems to speak at once. But medieval power rarely worked that simply. The Templars did not need buried treasure to become wealthy. They had donations, estates, privileges, discipline, and networks. They did not need forbidden knowledge to become influential. They had access to rulers, protection from certain local authorities, military usefulness, and the prestige of the crusading cause. They did not need a secret object to become feared. Their very structure was enough to unsettle people. In other words, the ordinary explanation is not weak. It is simply less theatrical. That may be why it struggles to compete. The idea of a hidden discovery beneath the Temple Mount gives the Templars a single dramatic turning point. Before the discovery, they are poor. After the discovery, they are powerful. It feels clean. It satisfies the mind's appetite for cause and effect. Real history is messier. Institutions grow through accumulation. A grant here, a privilege there, a useful alliance, a successful reputation, a disciplined rule, a steady flow of recruits, a network that becomes trusted because it has already been trusted before. None of this gives us the thrill of a secret chamber, but it explains far more. Still, the legends should not be dismissed as meaningless. They are evidence of something, not of buried treasure, but of cultural anxiety. People invented hidden Templars because the visible Templars were already difficult to understand. How could men sworn to poverty control so much wealth? How could monks become soldiers? How could a religious order operate across borders with privileges that local authorities could not easily penetrate? How could an institution so publicly holy be accused later of such private corruption? The legends gave shape to confusion. They turned structural power into symbolic treasure. They turned secrecy of rule into secrecy of knowledge. They turned proximity to the temple into proof of discovery. And after the order's fall, the myth became even harder to resist. A destroyed institution cannot defend itself well. Its archives are scattered. Its enemies speak loudly. Its former members grow old or disappear, and its reputation floats free from daily reality. Once the Templars were gone, they became available for reinvention. This is why the question, "What did they find?" may be less revealing than another question. Why did so many people need them to have found something? Perhaps because a hidden relic makes power feel explainable. Perhaps because sacred places invite the belief that the past has left clues for the worthy. Perhaps because the Templars stood at the crossing point of too many charged ideas: temple, sword, poverty, wealth, holiness, secrecy, betrayal. A normal explanation felt too small for such an abnormal image. So we should keep the mystery, but keep it honestly. There may have been storerooms, repairs, foundations, passages, and forgotten spaces near the areas where the Templars lived. Medieval buildings were not clean diagrams. Cities accumulate under themselves. But the leap from architectural complexity to world-changing discovery is a leap the evidence does not carry. The better story is quieter and more unsettling. The Templars found a name. They found a location. They found a mission that could turn violence into service and donations into power. They found, perhaps without fully intending it, that sacred geography can make an institution appear older, deeper, and stranger than it is, and later generations found in them exactly what they wanted most. A door into the idea that history's greatest truths are not lost, but hidden just beneath the stones. Chapter 12. The Real Secrets of Power. The word secret has done strange things to the Templars. It has pulled them into stories of hidden vaults, lost relics, underground archives, and rituals whispered beneath locked ceilings. It has made the order feel like a riddle waiting for a single missing key. But the most important secrets of the Templars were probably not buried under Jerusalem at all. They were visible, if you knew how to look. Discipline was one of them. A knight alone could be brave, reckless, loyal, vain, or dead before sunset. A disciplined order could outlast individual courage. The Templars were powerful because they turned men into parts of a larger body. A brother did not simply follow his own ambition. He entered a rule, a hierarchy, a daily rhythm of obedience. He could be moved, commanded, punished, trusted with a task, and replaced. That kind of structure is easy to underestimate because it does not glitter. It does not look like treasure. But in the medieval world, where politics often depended on personal bonds, family rivalries, feudal obligations, and local loyalties, an institution that could act with corporate discipline across distance possessed something rare. It had continuity. Continuity is one of the quiet foundations of power. Kings died. Lords rebelled. Heirs disputed inheritances. Crusading enthusiasm flared and faded. But an order could remember. It could keep records, preserve habits, train replacements, and carry a mission beyond the lifespan of any one man. That was a real secret. Not a hidden doctrine, but an organizational one. The Templars also possessed secrecy in the more ordinary institutional sense. Their internal rule, discipline, decisions, and procedures were not open to every outsider who grew curious. Religious communities had internal lives. Military organizations had operational needs. Financial agents needed trust and discretion. None of this required sinister conspiracy. But from outside, discretion can look very much like concealment. This is where suspicion grows naturally. A public mission combined with a private structure creates tension. People could see the Templars' churches, estates, castles, and brothers. They could hear of their bravery or failures in the East. They could donate to them, borrow from them, resent them, admire them. But they could not easily see the inner workings of the order. The gap between public image and private procedure became a space where imagination could gather. Financial trust was another secret, and perhaps one of the most powerful. Trust is not dramatic until it disappears. A person moving wealth across medieval Europe faced risk at every turn. Theft, shipwreck, war, dishonest agents, changing rulers, bad roads, worse weather. The Templars' network offered a solution because it had houses in many regions, a reputation for discipline, and a religious identity that made betrayal not merely criminal, but spiritually shameful. Of course, we should not exaggerate them into modern bankers with swords and Latin prayers. Their financial practices belonged to their own age, but they became useful to pilgrims, nobles, and rulers because they could hold valuables, transfer obligations, manage funds, and operate across borders with unusual reliability. That reliability was power. It meant people entrusted them not just with money, but with movement, strategy, and political possibility. A ruler who needed funds could deal with them. A pilgrim could rely on them. A noble could place resources in their care. Wealth flowed toward an institution that had already proved capable of handling wealth. Trust compounded. Then there was military strategy. The Templars were not simply romantic knights riding out beneath a white mantle. They were part of the hard defensive architecture of the Crusader states. They held castles, guarded routes, maintained horses, supplied garrisons, and absorbed the terrible costs of frontier warfare. They understood that piety did not hold a wall. Stone, grain, water, command, and readiness did. The order's military power came from being permanent. Crusading armies from Europe arrived in waves, full of energy and often full of internal tension. Then many crusaders died, settled, or returned home. The Templars stayed. Alongside other military orders, they offered continuity in a region where the Latin states could not depend forever on fresh enthusiasm from the West. Political access deepened their influence. Because they were tied to the papacy, respected by many nobles, and useful to kings, the Templars could move through levels of society that most knights could not. They were at once local landholders and international actors. A commander in one region might be connected, through the order's hierarchy, to decisions and resources far away. Their world was wider than the estates they stood on. And then came exemption. This may have been one of the most unsettling aspects of their power. The Templars enjoyed privileges that could place them beyond many local authorities. Such exemptions were meant to protect their mission and keep resources directed toward the defense of the Holy Land. But privileges granted for sacred purpose can look very different to the people who must live beside them. A bishop might resent a religious institution that did not answer to him as expected. A local lord might resent property he could not easily control. A debtor might resent a creditor wrapped in holiness. A rival might resent men whose independence seemed to grow with every donation. Independence is admired when it serves your cause. It becomes arrogance when it obstructs you. This is the core of the Templar problem. Their real power was not hidden from the world. It was embedded in the world. It appeared in legal privileges, in estates, in castles, in documents, in armed men, in the confidence of donors, in the dependence of rulers, and in the difficulty of holding them accountable through ordinary channels. That is far more historically plausible than a secret relic, and in some ways more frightening. A relic might sit in a chest. A system acts. The Templars' secrets were the techniques by which a sacred military order turned belief into durable influence. They understood obedience. They cultivated trust. They managed property. They guarded their internal life. They served powerful interests while remaining partly beyond them. They carried the prestige of Jerusalem into villages, courts, ports, and treasuries across Christendom. No wonder people later imagined something buried beneath their success. Visible systems are difficult to narrate. Hidden treasures are easy. A treasure has a shape. A system is everywhere and nowhere. It touches the farmer paying rent, the knight waiting for orders, the king seeking credit, the pilgrim seeking safety, the bishop reading a privilege he dislikes. It becomes part of daily life until people forget it was built by human decisions. The Templars' real secret was not that they escaped history. It was that they learned how to use the institutions of their age with extraordinary skill, and that skill made them powerful enough to be needed, rich enough to be envied, holy enough to be trusted, and independent enough to be feared. Chapter 13. Enemies in the Shadows. The Templars did not become hated because they were weak. They became hated because they were useful for too long, to too many powerful people, while belonging fully to none of them. That is a dangerous position for any institution. At first, independence looks like purity. It suggests that a group serves a higher mission, untouched by local squabbles and ordinary greed. But over time, the same independence begins to look like refusal. Refusal to submit. Refusal to explain. Refusal to bend when kings, bishops, debtors, and rivals decide that bending would be convenient. The Templars had many admirers. That should not be forgotten. They had donors, patrons, defenders, brothers who died in battle, and supporters who believed sincerely in their mission. Their reputation was not built on illusion alone. They had endured real hardship and held real responsibilities in the Latin East. But admiration and resentment can grow in the same soil. A noble family might praise the order in one generation and quarrel with it over property in the next. A bishop might respect its religious purpose while quietly resenting exemptions that weakened his authority. A king might rely on Templar financial services while disliking the discomfort of owing money to men who wore holiness as part of their public face. A local lord might donate land for salvation, only for his heirs to decide that salvation had become rather expensive. There is a small, bitter human truth here. Sacred institutions are easiest to admire when they do not interfere with inheritance. As the Templars accumulated estates, privileges, and influence, they inevitably touched the interests of others. Land given to the order was land removed from family strategies. Rents assigned to the order were rents no longer available elsewhere. Legal privileges that protected the order's mission could also frustrate neighboring authorities. Every advantage that made the Templars effective made someone else feel diminished. Their wealth made matters worse, not because wealth automatically proves corruption. That is too simple. Medieval religious institutions often became wealthy through donations, and many donors believed those gifts served a holy purpose. But the Templars' wealth carried a special tension because of the order's original image. They were supposed to be poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The individual vow of poverty could be explained. The institutional fortune could be defended. Still, to critics, the contrast was irresistible. A poor knight in a rich order is a complicated image. Complicated images invite hostile interpretation. The failure of crusading fortunes in the East also damaged the atmosphere around them. As the Latin Christian position in the Holy Land weakened, military orders like the Templars became easier to criticize. Their defenders could point to sacrifice, endurance, impossible conditions, and the sheer difficulty of defending scattered territories. Their critics could ask why so much wealth had produced so little permanent success. That question was unfair in some ways. No order, however disciplined, could reverse every political and military reality of the Eastern Mediterranean. But public reputation rarely obeys fairness. When a mission is sacred, disappointment often becomes accusation. If God's cause is losing ground, someone must have failed. Someone must have been proud, corrupt, cowardly, greedy, or secretly unworthy. The Templars were visible enough to blame. They were also secretive enough to imagine. Their internal life, like that of many religious orders, was not open to casual inspection. Their ceremonies, discipline, chapters, punishments, and decisions were governed within the order. This privacy had practical and spiritual reasons, but outsiders, especially hostile ones, could turn privacy into suspicion. A closed door does not need to conceal anything shocking to become useful in rumor. It only needs to remain closed. And by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Europe was full of pressures looking for a target. Kings were strengthening their administrations. Monarchs wanted revenue, obedience, and clearer lines of authority. The papacy itself was caught in conflicts with secular rulers. The crusading project had lost some of its old confidence. The Holy Land, once the great theater of Latin Christian hope, had become a place of painful defeats and shrinking possibilities. In that world, an international order with wealth, privileges, armed history, and papal connections could look less like a miracle and more like a problem. The Templars' sacred reputation, which had once protected them, began to harden into a liability. This is one of the cruel patterns of history. The qualities that raise an institution can later be used against it. Their discipline became secrecy. Their wealth became greed. Their exemptions became arrogance. Their international reach became foreignness. Their military failures became evidence of spiritual decay. Their name, tied to the temple, became a doorway through which darker fantasies could enter. Enemies did not have to invent suspicion from nothing. They only had to rearrange existing discomforts into a case. That is how reputations collapse. Not usually by one accusation appearing in an empty room, but by many half-formed resentments suddenly being given a common language. The person who had lost a lawsuit, the ruler who owed money, the churchman who disliked exemptions, the critic offended by wealth, the public disturbed by crusading failure. Each could find a reason to believe the worst. None of this proves the later charges against the order. It explains why such charges could travel. The Templars had become too large to be invisible and too unusual to be easily defended. Ordinary institutions can hide inside familiar categories. The Templars could not. They were religious but armed, poor but wealthy, obedient but independent, local landholders but international agents, servants of the church but sometimes beyond local church control. The very structure that made them effective made them vulnerable to being described as unnatural. And once an institution is seen as unnatural, almost any accusation can begin to sound possible. The shadows around the Templars were therefore not only shadows of hidden rooms or secret rites. They were political shadows, financial shadows, legal shadows, emotional shadows. They were cast by envy, debt, disappointment, and fear of power that did not fit neatly into the hands of kings. By the time their greatest enemy moved against them, the ground had already been prepared, not with proof, with resentment. And resentment, when given a royal seal, can become far more dangerous than rumor whispered in the dark. Chapter 14. The King Who Needed Their Fall. Philip IV of France did not need the Templars to be mysterious. He needed them to be vulnerable. That is the colder way to enter the story. Not through a hidden chamber, not through a forbidden ritual, but through the machinery of royal power. By the early 14th century, the Templars were wealthy, privileged, and internationally connected. They were also exposed. Their original purpose had been weakened by the loss of the main Crusader footholds in the Holy Land. Their reputation still carried the glow of sacred service, but the practical question had become harder to avoid. What exactly were they now? For a king like Philip, that question was useful. Philip IV was not a ruler inclined to leave power lying outside his reach. His reign was marked by strong royal administration, conflict with the papacy, pressure for revenue, and a hard vision of monarchy. He needed money. He needed control. He needed symbols. The Templars, with their estates, treasure, privileges, and aura of secrecy, stood in a very dangerous place, close enough to royal authority to be useful, independent enough to be intolerable. They also had what indebted rulers often dislike most: records, trust, a reputation for holding wealth safely. It is tempting to reduce Philip's attack to greed alone, and greed was certainly part of the atmosphere. But greed by itself does not explain the precision of what followed. The fall of the Templars required more than appetite. It required a story strong enough to turn public suspicion into official action. A king could not simply say, "They are rich, and I want what they have." He needed moral language. He needed scandal. He needed accusations so poisonous that hesitation would look like complicity. Heresy provided that language. The charges brought against the Templars were not mild criticisms of arrogance or financial excess. They were accusations designed to stain the order at its deepest point: denial of Christ, obscene rites, blasphemy, corruption, secret worship, and other claims that struck directly at their identity as holy warriors. The order's strength had always been its sacred image, so the attack had to make that image look like a mask. This was a political weapon shaped like a spiritual emergency. And it worked because the Templars were already surrounded by unease. Their secrecy could be recast as evidence. Their wealth could be recast as corruption. Their independence could be recast as conspiracy. Their private initiation rites, like the private ceremonies of many closed communities, could be described in monstrous terms by frightened or coerced witnesses. Once the frame was set, Ordinary ambiguity became suspicious. That is how accusation changes reality. Before the accusation, a closed door may be merely a closed door. After the accusation, it becomes the place where something must have happened. Silence becomes proof. Inconsistency becomes proof. Denial becomes proof. Confession becomes proof even when obtained under terror. The system begins feeding on itself. Philip understood the power of timing. A coordinated move against the Templars could prevent them from preparing a defense. It could seize men, documents, and property before the order's international connections could protect it. It could present the monarchy not as a predator, but as guardian of the faith. If the charges were horrific enough, then the king could appear almost reluctant, a Christian ruler forced by conscience to uncover evil. That appearance mattered. Power often prefers to dress as duty. The papacy complicated the matter. The Templars were not simply Philip's subjects to dispose of at will. They were a religious order with papal connections and privileges. Any attack on them touched the authority of the Church, but Philip had already shown that he was willing to pressure popes and challenge ecclesiastical power when royal interests demanded it. The Templar affair unfolded in that larger struggle between monarchy and papacy, between sacred jurisdiction and royal ambition. For the Templars, this was disastrous. Their special status had once helped protect them from local enemies, but against a determined king who could bend legal, political, and religious pressure toward one target, privilege became less secure. Their international identity did not save them. It made them look even more alien inside a monarchy trying to consolidate control. The accusations were powerful because they inverted everything the Templars claimed to be. They claimed poverty. They were accused of greed. They claimed obedience. They were accused of secret rebellion against the faith. They claimed to defend Christendom. They were accused of betraying Christ. They claimed discipline. They were accused of ritual corruption. It was not enough to destroy their usefulness. Their meaning had to be destroyed. This is why the attack feels so dark, even from a distance of centuries. It was not only a legal prosecution, it was an assault on memory. The order that had wrapped itself in Solomon's temple, crusading sacrifice, and monastic discipline was forced into a new story written by its enemies. In that story, the temple was not sacred inheritance. It was concealment. The white mantle was not purity. It was disguise. Were some Templars guilty of misconduct? Almost certainly, in the ordinary human sense that large institutions contained failures, abuses, arrogance, and corruption. No serious history needs to imagine the order as spotless. But the sweeping charges of organized heresy remain deeply problematic, especially given the use of imprisonment, pressure, and torture in producing confessions. The evidence must be handled carefully. What we can see more clearly is the political usefulness of the charges. They allowed Philip to move against an institution he could not otherwise easily absorb. They transformed financial and jurisdictional conflict into a drama of faith. They gave resentment a legal form and fear a religious vocabulary. The king did not have to prove the legend of Templar darkness to every future historian. He only had to make the accusation powerful enough in his own time. And once a charge like heresy enters the bloodstream of history, it does not leave cleanly. Even after legal debates, recantations, papal hesitation, and the passage of centuries, the stain remains useful. Later writers would return to it, reshape it, exaggerate it, or reject it. The same accusations meant to destroy the order would help make it immortal. Philip needed their fall. But in striking at the Templars' mystery, he made sure the mystery would never die. Chapter 15. Confession, Torture, and Fire. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the trap closed. Across France, Templar brothers were arrested by order of Philip IV. The move was sudden, coordinated, and devastating. Men who had worn the mantle of a sacred military order were taken into custody as suspected heretics. Houses were searched. Property was seized. The king's officers moved with the confidence of a government that had prepared its blow in advance. It is one of those dates that later legend loves because it feels too precise to be ordinary. A Friday, the 13th, a secretive order, a royal conspiracy, arrests in the dark. History rarely hands storytellers such convenient material, and when it does, caution is necessary. The date was real. The atmosphere was real. But the meaning attached to it afterward became far larger than the morning itself. The fall of the Templars did not create every superstition later tied to Friday the 13th. Nor should we pretend that one dramatic day explains centuries of fear. Still, as an image of institutional destruction, the arrests remain almost unbearably powerful. The king had moved first, and speed mattered. Once the brothers were isolated, the machinery of confession began. The charges were shocking: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene initiation practices, secret worship, and other claims meant to make the order appear not merely corrupt, but spiritually inverted. These accusations struck at the heart of the Templar identity. If true, they would mean that the defenders of Christendom had hidden blasphemy beneath the uniform of devotion. But the confessions came under conditions that make them deeply troubled. Imprisonment, fear, pressure, and torture shaped the record. Men confessed, recanted, contradicted themselves, named practices they later denied, or tried to survive the questions placed before them. Some admissions may have reflected distorted initiation customs, hazing, humiliation, or misunderstood rituals. Some may have been entirely forced. Some may have been shaped by interrogators who already knew the answers they wanted. Torture does not reveal truth cleanly. It produces speech. That is not the same thing. This is one of the darkest parts of the Templar story. Not because it offers a clear villain in every room, but because it shows how legal and religious systems can make fear sound official. A confession written down by authority can appear stable on parchment. It has names, dates, questions, witnesses, seals. It looks like evidence. Yet behind the lines may be a body in pain, a prisoner trying to guess what will make the suffering stop, a man saying what he thinks he must say in order to live another hour. The order's enemies understood the value of confession. Heresy was not simply a crime of action. It was a crime of belief, of hidden inward corruption. That made the spoken admission especially powerful. If a Templar confessed to blasphemy, the accusation seemed to open the locked door of the soul. The private became public. The hidden became recorded. But coerced confession is a treacherous foundation for justice. The papacy was drawn into the crisis under immense pressure. Pope Clement V did not simply invent Philip's campaign, but neither could he ignore a royal prosecution already in motion. The Templars belonged to the Church in a way that made the Pope's role essential. Yet the political pressure from the French crown was heavy, and the affair became entangled in the broader struggle between papal authority and royal power. Across Europe, the results were uneven. Outside France, many Templars were treated with less severity, and the evidence did not always produce the same dark picture Philip's government promoted. This unevenness matters. If the order had been universally and obviously committed to a secret heresy, we might expect clearer consistency across regions. Instead, what we find is a prosecution shaped strongly by local pressure, especially in France. That does not mean every Templar was innocent of every wrongdoing. Large institutions are never made of saints alone, but the great claim that the order as a whole was secretly devoted to systematic blasphemy remains difficult to sustain with confidence. What happened instead was more human and more frightening. An institution already burdened by suspicion was placed under extreme force. Its members were arrested. Its reputation was poisoned. Its defenders were weakened by fear and procedure. Its words were extracted and turned against it. Once a holy order had been publicly named as corrupt, rescue became politically dangerous. Who wanted to appear soft on heresy? Who wanted to defend men accused of denying Christ? Fear narrowed the world. Some Templars recanted their confessions. Some maintained admissions. Some disappeared into prison. Some tried to navigate the impossible middle ground between obedience, survival, and conscience. The story eventually drew toward one of its most famous figures, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Order. De Molay's end has been retold with layers of legend, including dramatic curses and prophetic words that later writers loved to repeat. The safer historical picture is already severe enough. He was caught inside a process that had destroyed the order he led. In 1314, after years of imprisonment and proceedings, he was burned in Paris after retracting his confession. The scene is often imagined at high pitch. Flames, defiance, a curse thrown toward king and pope. Some of those details belong more securely to later tradition than to careful evidence. But the central fact does not need embellishment. The last Grand Master of the Templars died by fire, and with him the public life of the order closed in a way that guaranteed it would never become merely administrative history. Fire turns a legal decision into an image, and images survive. The dissolution of the Templars had already been ordered before de Molay's death. Their properties were transferred, their names suppressed, their brothers dispersed into other fates. But the execution gave the story its final wound. It made the fall visible. It offered later generations a martyr, a villain, or a warning, depending on what they wanted the Templars to mean. Was justice done? The honest answer is difficult, but it leans dark. The process was shaped by royal need, coercion, papal pressure, fear of heresy, and the political usefulness of destroying a wealthy, independent order. Greed alone is too small an explanation. So is pure religious concern. The fall of the Templars blurred them together until the boundary between law and propaganda became almost impossible to draw cleanly. That may be why the story still troubles us. Not because we know the order was innocent in every possible way, but because the method of its destruction feels contaminated at the root. A powerful king needed a sacred enemy. A frightened legal system produced confessions. A pope under pressure dissolved what had once been blessed. A Grand Master died in flames. And afterward, the world was left with documents that speak loudly, but not always truthfully. The Templars had built their identity beside the memory of a vanished temple. In the end, they became a ruin themselves, dismantled by accusation, preserved by silence, and lit forever by the fire meant to erase them. Chapter 16. The Temple. After the Templars, an order can be dissolved faster than it can be forgotten. That was the problem left behind after the Templars disappeared from official life. The institution had been condemned, dismantled, and stripped of its legal existence. Its properties were reassigned. Its brothers were judged, absorbed, pensioned, imprisoned, or left to live out quieter endings depending on place and circumstance. The name was no longer supposed to function as a living order. But suppression is not the same as erasure. In fact, it often does the opposite. The Templars had occupied too much space in the medieval imagination to vanish neatly. They had held lands across Europe. They had fought in the Holy Land. They had handled money for kings and nobles. They had built churches, commanderies, castles, records, relationships, and enemies. Their fall touched too many lives and interests to become a closed matter. Even the transfer of a property could not fully settle the question. Estates might pass to other hands, but memory did not follow legal instructions. A former Templar house could be renamed or repurposed, yet the older association remained in local speech. A field once held by the temple might remain Templar in habit long after the order itself was gone. Buildings are very poor at obeying the endings written for them. They keep suggesting continuities. Some former brothers entered other religious orders. Some were allowed to live under supervision or with pensions. Others had faced harsher fates during the trials. The picture varied across regions because the persecution itself had not unfolded evenly everywhere. In France, the crown's pressure had been severe. Elsewhere, the atmosphere could be different. The accusations less forceful, the outcomes less dramatic. That unevenness left room for later imagination. If the order was destroyed in one place but not quite destroyed in the same way elsewhere, then perhaps, people wondered, something survived. If brothers were not all executed, perhaps they carried secrets. If properties were transferred but stories remained, perhaps the order only went underground. If the accusations were unreliable, perhaps the official ending was only a cover for another history. Here again, perhaps begins to work like a small opening in a locked door. Historically, there is a difference between surviving former members and a surviving secret order. The first is certain enough in broad terms. Men who had belonged to the temple did not all vanish in flames. The second is a much larger claim and requires evidence that legend usually does not provide. A living man with memories is not the same as an underground institution with hidden leadership, rituals, treasure, and a plan stretching across centuries. But myth does not require that distinction. Myth sees scattered survivors and imagines continuity. It sees silence and imagines concealment. It sees unanswered questions and imagines design. The reputation of the Templars grew stronger after death, partly because no living order remained to make it ordinary again. Living institutions are full of dull details. They argue over accounts. They repair roofs. They discipline difficult members. They lose documents, mismanage farms, negotiate rents, and disappoint their admirers. Death removes the dullness. It leaves the image. And the Templars had one of the strongest images in medieval history. The white mantle, the red cross, the Temple of Solomon, the poor knight, the wealthy network, the secret accusation, the tortured confession, the Grand Master in the fire. These fragments could be rearranged endlessly. They did not need to produce one coherent story. They only needed to remain vivid. Absence made them available. That may be the most important afterlife of the order. Once the Templars were gone, they became less a group of specific medieval men and more a symbol that later generations could use. To some, they became martyrs crushed by royal greed. To others, they remained corrupt warriors exposed at last. To conspiracy-minded writers, they became guardians of a hidden truth. To romantics, they were tragic knights of a lost sacred world. To skeptics, they were proof that institutions wrapped in holiness can become dangerously powerful. Each version says something about the people telling it. The historical Templars became harder to see behind those reflections. Their real achievements and failures were complicated, practical, and often unglamorous. Their afterlife was cleaner, sharper, more dramatic. A dissolved order does not interrupt you to explain its accounting systems. A dead Grand Master does not correct your legend. A ruined commandery does not object when you turn it into a clue. This is why the Templars' destruction did not end the mystery. It improved it. Their enemies had tried to fix their meaning through accusation. The Church had ended the order's formal existence. Rulers and other institutions had absorbed much of what they left behind. Yet none of these acts answered the emotional questions the fall created. Were they guilty? Were they betrayed? Did they hide something? Did the king destroy them for money, power, faith, or fear? Was their sacred image a mask, or was the prosecution itself the greater corruption? The evidence allows careful answers to some of these questions, but not the kind that satisfies legend completely. We can see political pressure. We can see financial motives. We can see the unreliability of confessions under torture. We can see the awkward reality of a wealthy order sworn to poverty. We can see why accusations found an audience. But we cannot reconstruct every private room, every initiation, every conversation, every fear. So the Templars remained partly unfinished. Their official ending came through documents, councils, transfers, and executions. Their imaginative ending never arrived. The dissolved order became a kind of historical echo. The more distant the original sound, the more freely people mistook the echo for a voice. And the temple connection made that echo deeper. Had they been called only the poor knights of Jerusalem, their legend might still have survived. But the Temple of Solomon gave their memory a vertical dimension. It pointed downward into ruins, backward into scripture, upward into sacred authority. Even after their properties were scattered, the name continued to suggest hidden depth. The real remains of the Templars were not only lands and buildings. They were questions. Questions are difficult property to confiscate. A king can seize a treasury. A pope can dissolve an order. A court can record confessions. A council can assign estates elsewhere. But no authority can fully govern what later generations will wonder in the dark spaces left behind. The Templars ceased to exist as an official order. Then, almost immediately, they began the longer life for which they are now best known. The life of rumor, memory, accusation, admiration, and absence. The temple after the Templars was no longer a headquarters. It was a vacancy, and into that vacancy, history poured myth. Chapter 17. The invention of the hidden Templars. The dead are easier to organize than the living. Once the Templars were gone, later centuries could arrange them into almost any pattern they desired. No Grand Master remained to issue corrections. No ordinary brother could complain that a theory had misunderstood the accounts, the horses, the barns, the discipline, or the daily exhaustion of commandery life. The order had become a set of symbols, and symbols are notoriously easy to recruit. This is where the hidden Templars were born. Not in one secret meeting, not through one unbroken chain of proof, but slowly, through the work of imagination, politics, literature, rumor, and the human refusal to let a dramatic ending remain merely an ending. The ingredients were already waiting: a sacred name, a destroyed order, accusations of secret rites, confessions made under torture, wealth that seemed too large for poverty, a last Grand Master burned in Paris, a connection to the Temple Mount, where so many traditions had placed so much longing. Add time, and the story begins to ferment. Later writers and storytellers linked the Templars to hidden treasure, the Holy Grail, forbidden knowledge, underground brotherhoods, and secret continuities stretching beyond their official destruction. In some versions, surviving knights escaped with relics. In others, they carried ancient wisdom into later secret societies. Sometimes they became guardians of a bloodline, sometimes keepers of a sacred object, sometimes victims of a conspiracy so vast that the lack of evidence becomes, conveniently, part of the evidence. That last move is always worth noticing. When a theory survives by turning absence into proof, it has stepped outside the discipline of history. Missing documents may mean concealment. They may also mean fire, neglect, routine disposal, bad preservation, or the simple fact that medieval record-keeping was uneven. A silence in the archive can be meaningful, but it cannot be forced to confess whatever we want. Still, these legends should not be dismissed as foolish noise. They tell us something real, even when they do not tell us what actually happened. The hidden Templar myth endured because the official story felt morally incomplete. The order had been blessed, enriched, used, feared, accused, tortured, dissolved, and partly absorbed by the same Christian world that had once praised it. That is a difficult arc to accept without looking for deeper design. People often prefer conspiracy to contradiction. Conspiracy gives history an architect. Contradiction gives us institutions, ambition, fear, faith, debt, law, violence, and human weakness tangled together without a single clean explanation. The Templars were perfect material for this kind of afterlife, because they stood at the crossing of opposites. They were poor and rich, religious and military, publicly honored and privately accused, destroyed by authority yet remembered as possibly innocent, connected to a vanished temple and to surviving properties scattered across Europe. Such contradictions do not rest quietly. They keep generating stories. The Holy Grail connection is a good example of how cultural memory works. The Grail belonged first to the world of medieval romance, not to a proven Templar archive, but romance and Templar legend shared a similar emotional landscape. Sacred quests, hidden purity, chosen guardians, lost holiness, and the idea that only the worthy could approach the deepest truth. It was almost inevitable that later imagination would bring them together. The same happened with secret societies. When later ages became fascinated by hidden brotherhoods, initiations, symbols, and concealed wisdom, the Templars offered a ready-made ancestor. They had a dramatic name, a tragic fall, and enough real secrecy in their internal life to make fictional secrecy feel plausible. A later group seeking ancient prestige could borrow the temple just as the Templars themselves had once borrowed Solomon's aura. That does not make the continuity proven. It makes the borrowing understandable. Every age invents the Templars it needs. The Romantic Age could see noble martyrs. Anti-clerical writers could see victims of church corruption. Conspiracy writers could see guardians of suppressed truth. National storytellers could place them in local caves, castles, islands, and lineages. Popular entertainment could turn them into villains, heroes, bankers, assassins, mystics, or all of these at once, preferably with a sword and a very dramatic cloak. The result is that the word Templar now carries two histories. One is medieval and difficult. Charters, councils, castles, vows, crusading warfare, donations, papal privileges, royal debt, trials, and fire. The other is cultural and dreamlike. Treasure maps, grail legends, hidden vaults, secret heirs, coded symbols, underground survival. The danger comes when the second history pretends to replace the first. But the second should still be studied, because it reveals the emotional life of the first. Legends grow where history has pressure points. The Templars' official fall left wounds in the record and in moral imagination. The myths are scar tissue. They are not the original injury, but they show where later generations kept touching the pain. Why did the myth endure? Because it gives people a way to believe that sacred loss is not final. If the temple was destroyed, perhaps something from it survived. If the Templars were dissolved, perhaps they continued. If confessions were coerced, perhaps the real truth escaped. If history appears ruled by kings, courts, and flames, perhaps a deeper story moved beneath it all. That hope is powerful. It is also dangerous. It can make us careless with evidence. It can flatten real people into props for modern fantasies. It can turn the Temple Mount, a living and contested sacred place, into a backdrop for someone else's adventure. It can make medieval suffering seem valuable only if it hides a puzzle. The Templars deserve better than that. Not because they were pure. They were not. No institution that powerful should be handled with innocence. But their real story is already rich enough. The fusion of monastic discipline and warfare. The use of sacred geography to build authority. The transformation of donations into international power. The vulnerability of a privileged order before a determined king, and the way accusation can outlive evidence. The hidden Templars, then, are not simply a false trail. They are the afterimage of a collapse no one ever fully digested. The order died in law, but survived in imagination, because it had been built from materials imagination cannot leave alone. Temple, sword, secrecy, wealth, faith, betrayal, and fire. Later centuries did not invent the fascination from nothing. They found it waiting in the ruins and gave it new costumes. The real question is not whether every hidden Templar story is true. Most are not, at least not in the way they claim. The better question is why the world kept needing them to be true. And the answer may be that the Templars offered something history rarely offers, a doorway between fact and longing, where the absence of proof felt to many like the beginning of revelation. Chapter 18. The secret that was never buried. In the end, the darkest secret of the Templars may not have been hidden beneath the Temple Mount at all. No golden chest needs to be opened for the story to unsettle us. No lost relic has to be lifted from the earth. The real secret is older, quieter, and more difficult to dismiss. Sacred places can turn human ambition into something that feels eternal. That is what happened around Solomon's temple. A building vanished, but its meaning did not. Its memory survived destruction, conquest, reinterpretation, longing, and grief. It became more than architecture. It became a mirror in which different ages saw authority, loss, holiness, restoration, and power. When the Templars took their identity from that memory, they stepped into a story far larger than themselves. They were not the first to claim sacred geography. They were not the last. But their case shows how dangerous the fusion can become. Faith gave them purpose. War gave them urgency. Discipline gave them structure. Wealth gave them reach. Privilege gave them independence. The temple gave them a name that sounded ancient before their order had grown old. And then the same forces turned against them. Their secrecy became suspicious. Their wealth became offensive. Their sacred image became vulnerable to accusations of blasphemy. Their independence became intolerable to a king who needed control. When they fell, the violence of their destruction left just enough uncertainty for legend to enter. That is why the myth endured. Not because history proves they found forbidden knowledge under Jerusalem. It does not. Not because every accusation against them was true. The evidence is too damaged, too coerced, too political for such certainty. The myth endured because the Templars stood at the crossroads of things people still struggle to separate. Devotion and violence, poverty and power, memory and possession, justice and propaganda. The world wanted a buried secret because a buried secret is easier to understand than a human system. Treasure explains wealth. A hidden relic explains authority. A conspiracy explains contradiction. But the real explanation is more uncomfortable. The Templars became powerful because medieval society made them powerful. Kings, nobles, churchmen, pilgrims, donors, and warriors all helped build the order they later feared. Their rise was not magic. It was the result of belief organized into land, law, money, and force. That is the lesson beneath the legend. Solomon's temple remained a vanished building, but also an eternal symbol, a place where people placed their hope that holiness could have a home, that loss could be repaired, that the past might still be waiting beneath the present. The Templars became part of that longing. Then they became prisoners of it. So when we imagine them near the Temple Mount, we should not only picture men searching underground, we should picture men standing inside a memory too powerful to control, a memory that gave them authority, a memory that drew suspicion, a memory that outlived their castles, their trials, their enemies, and their fire. The secret was never simply under the stones. It was in the way human beings look at sacred ruins and see what they most desire: proof, judgment, treasure, innocence, betrayal, redemption. And perhaps that is why the temple still haunts the story of the Templars. Not as a solved mystery, but as an open mirror, a lost sanctuary, a fallen order, and a silence deep enough for centuries to keep speaking into it.